I am
The Department of Government Efficiency that I guess just as little as 8 weeks ago didn't even exist. And here we are with the formation of something that actually has some potential to expose waste, government waste, that really hadn't been on any candidate's docket across the Senate, across the House, and both presidential candidates. And here we are. Is there any hope that this could actually work? And what do you think the real issues are now for the markets?
I'm quite excited about DOGE, and I was just, as we talked about, I was just on the road for about 2 weeks, and I was surprised at how quickly the idea of a Department of Government Efficiency got into the lexicon of investors in Seoul and Zurich and London, so that within a week, people are actually talking about it. And I would say this seems far more serious, or a far more serious effort to rein in government spending than, let's say, something like Simpson-Bowles, which was very well intentioned but very much inside the beltway approach to doing it, and it was quite easy for people on both sides of the aisle to ignore it. And politicians, generally speaking, are put on earth to give stuff away, not to take stuff away. So there's unless there's actually the kind of frontier justice of higher interest rates, in my opinion, government spending reform doesn't really happen. This time it may be being forced to happen simply because the president wants to keep his tax cuts that were passed through the TCJA in 2017, and it's going to be hard to do that without some good faith effort to either raise, you don't want to raise taxes, but there's going to be some good faith effort to save money if you want to keep the tax cuts. And so that's why I think there's this renewed focus on it. And I think, thank goodness, because I do think it is very difficult. It would be very difficult to run deficits of this magnitude for a lot longer without it having some meaningful impact on either interest rates or inflation.
I think so too. I also suspect that these two individuals, Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, carry a heavy load of credibility for the private sector. And I think they're approaching this as a crowdsourced type priority list. They're very prolific on Twitter. They're collecting recommendations from everybody, so that they're going to be able to look inside the budget. So their potential to find the low-hanging fruit right off the bat should be very high. Where do you think this comes out? I'm kind of hoping that what happens is that they shine a light on all of the people that have connected themselves to the government who are enriching themselves with fat margins. And that by exposing that, I think you're going to get not only a lot of actual cutting, but you might get a lot of voluntary withdrawal too, where people just don't want to be exposed.
Yeah, you might. I mean, and I would say, listen, I think that when people start talking about Trump, I think people tend to, and I think it's partly because the President Trump himself, tends to speak in such, such grandiloquent terms that people tend to get caught up, and they kind of lose sight of kind of just the general direction of things, and they get very caught up on the details. I think just the fact that we're talking about cutting spending is a big deal. Because there's, again, especially since QE started, there's been no serious discussion of cutting spending. And there's about 3 million federal workers in the federal government, and to my knowledge, from the things I've read, only about 20% of them show up to work every day. So if you just think about the waste and just real estate alone, that's pretty significant. So. You either want to get more productivity or you need fewer workers. And I just as someone who runs my own company, I'm very skeptical about the idea that people working from home are as productive as people working in an office. I could be old-fashioned or old, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise. Government agencies generally just grow. They never die. I think Ronald Reagan said there's nothing closer to eternal life than some sort of government agency, right? And they just find new things to regulate or to look into. And I do think, obviously, there's a role for federal government. I don't want to disparage anyone that works for the federal government, but I also think that it has to be in proportion to really what the efforts or what the goal of federal government is, which is really just to facilitate private enterprise. It should not be an enterprise in and of itself. It's something that should help people as opposed to something that becomes its own industry. Right now, as you may know, I think of the 20 wealthiest counties in the United States, 11 of them are in and around Washington, D.C. And that's an area that really has no industry to speak of, no manufacturing to speak of. The industry largely is influenced the legislative process in some way, either through on the tax code or laws or government contracts, and that's not healthy. I think it not only is it likely wasteful, it also sows distrust among the taxpayer that's far from Washington, D.C. about the efficiency of what's going on there.
Well, capital that's directed to and by the federal government, or any government for that matter, just has a different objective as its purpose. And so there's an inefficiency built in, an economic inefficiency for this system when the government is taking that capital and spending it in any way. This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com. And so there's, one of the things that people are going to be talking about a lot is that the federal employees, as well as state and local employment, was a large portion of the employment growth over the last few years, and that this constant deficit spending was actually stimulative to the economy, partially because more people are employed. Ultimately, this should be a very big benefit to the country, but in the near term, it may not be. Just like in Argentina with Milei, the first thing he did was eliminate a lot of jobs. I've seen $500 billion worth of payroll, give or take, in the federal government in a $6.5 trillion spend. And so there's probably a lot more easy money to find without firing employees than by just exposing all of the contracts that are no bid, et cetera.
Right, and I think here, again, it's instructive for people to think more directionally as opposed to specifically, right? It reminds me of Peter Thiel saying, his President Trump's detractors take him literally, but they don't take him seriously, and his supporters take him seriously, but they don't take him literally. The hard part about what the incoming Trump administration is trying to do is you're trying to do this without an obvious crisis. And so whereas Argentina, there was probably an obvious crisis, and there was really there was a real sense that this had to be done. Here, I would say if you're in the half of the population that doesn't own financial assets, you feel as if there's a crisis. But for the people that do, or the upper 50% of income earners, they don't see much need for this. And this is the political challenge that the administration may have. But there's no question in my mind, I keep going back to QE. QE is the fig leaf that allowed this kind of spending to happen because we were able to manipulate interest rates. If it weren't for that, I'm convinced we would already be in a crisis. If the Fed's balance sheet weren't $7 trillion, if it were a mere $3 trillion or $4 trillion before the
or 1.5 where it started.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, it was 800 billion before Bear Stearns failed. So that was the fig leaf that allowed a lot of this extra government spending to happen. So, but the hard part again is that at least outwardly, if you have a job, you probably feel okay. And so economy may slow down, but I tend to think it'll be a little bit more localized. It'll hurt in Washington, Northern Virginia, and Maryland, and I feel badly for people in that area. But there should never be a place in the United States that doesn't have a business cycle. I very much feel that markets do a better job of allocating resources than small groups of unelected people. Yeah.
Hey, if you like this clip, please hit the subscribe button. You might also want to check out some of the clips I've posted with my many other guests. My interviews all address the simple question, how screwed are we? We ask experts about the problems that make Americans so pessimistic today, but we also explore why there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspective on today's challenges and opportunities.